everybody. Welcome on board. It's my pleasure now to welcome you to this very first IE breakfast on the webinar mode. As you may see, there is no pastries. We have a great guest, and now it's my pleasure to welcome you on this online version of the Council of Europe IE breakfast. I'm pleased to welcome you with Juliette Lelieur, and I will let Juliette introduce our experts today. Juliette, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Yannick. Thank you very much for the floor, and I'm happy that we are continuing our breakfast on artificial intelligence and law on this way. I'm very happy to present three experts this morning. Our first expert is Michael Veale. He's a lecturer in digital rights and regulation at University College of London. His research sits at the intersection of emerging digital technologies, internet and data law, technology policy, and human-computer interaction. Thank you very much, Michael, for being with us this morning. Our second expert is from Italy, Dino Pedreschi. Dino Pedreschi is a professor of computer science at University of Pisa. He is a pioneering scientist in mobility data mining, social network mining, and privacy preserving data mining. He has recently contributed, together with other researchers, to a manifesto called Give More Data Awareness and Control to Individual Citizens, and they will help COVID-19 containment. Thank you very much, Dino, for being with us. And our third expert is Adrien Basdevant from France. He's a lawyer, member of the Paris Bar. He focuses on data protection, cybercriminality, and emerging technologies. He defends civil liberties in the information society, which is very important at the moment, and advises numerous startups. He is the author of a very good book, L'Empire des Données, and he is, generally speaking, working at the intersection of law, technology, and policy. I would like to thank you very much, all three of us, for being with us this morning, and I'll give the floor back to Yannick.
Yes, thanks a lot, Juliette. And it's also my pleasure to welcome three colleagues that will ask questions to our expert. The first one is Sophie Kwasny, Head of Data Protection Unit. We will have also the two co-secretaries of our ad hoc committee on artificial intelligence, Livia Stoica and Clementina Barbaro. They will ask to the expert some questions. And we will have also with us two directors, Claudia Luciani. It's my pleasure to welcome her on this recording. And also Jan Kleijsen, who is also director at the Council of Europe. And Patrick Penninx will conclude with Claudia this high breakfast. Maybe, Juliette, we can begin now this high breakfast.
Yes, I think we are ready to start. So to begin, I will give the floor to our two directors at the Council of Europe, Claudia Luciani and Jan Kleijsen.
Just to say, at this stage, I would rather leave space for the debate. So it's my pleasure to welcome you very much and come back maybe later with questions. I prefer to leave the room for the interventions and see what at later stage what can be more relevant. Thank you, and welcome to everyone.
Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy I can be with you, if only virtually. Thank you to Juliette and Yannick for the organization, as always. Thank you very much to the experts for being with us. Grazie mille. Thank you very much indeed. We live in an extraordinary period, and it is also clear that we're all worried. You're worried, we're worried, everyone is worried. We're worried about our health, we're worried about our families, but we're also worried about the consequences of this period for our societies, for our democracies, for our fundamental rights, and of course also for the economic stability of our societies. It is therefore also entirely natural that people look for solutions, be it a medical solution, a vaccine, treatment, or anything else that can help us fight or beat this virus, and pending that, anything that can help us return to some degree of normal living together again. So it's also entirely natural that people look to technology. AI, algorithms, they have a magical ring about them to many people. They're very promising. There's a lot of hype. And of course, the media broadcast almost daily examples of parts of the world where artificial intelligence, technological solutions generally, and in particular also tracking apps in this case, are used and reportedly often with some degree of success in making it possible to get out of isolation and to return to some degree of normality. But even in extraordinary times, when extraordinary measures may be necessary, we should be very careful not to believe immediately that a technical solution is the solution and that technology somehow provides us with a silver bullet to win this fight. It is therefore very important that before we start using technology, and especially on an unprecedented scale, and with possibly unprecedented effects on our democratic system, on our values, that we make a very, very good analysis of what is needed and what technology can do. It's extremely important. And that is, there was a letter addressed by a very broad mix of international scientists, many of them based in the Netherlands, to the Dutch government that you may have come across. It was widely shared on social media, notably. The scientists come from virtually every field. There are medical doctors, there are computer scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, you name it. And they addressed a letter to the Dutch government, which is among other governments also considering the introduction of a tracking app, drawing attention to a number of risks. And they also quite rightly point out, and I will not abuse my time to go through the whole document, but I would strongly recommend it, and perhaps afterwards we can provide a link. There's an English version of this, a link to our participants in this breakfast. The question zero. Question zero is, can technology do what it is claimed to do? Is it at all possible to contain the spread of the virus through, for instance, tracking apps? I'll leave it, of course, to the experts and to this debate to provide questions to this. But I think it is the fundamental first question, rightly, I think, labeled question zero. Then a whole series of other questions. If that question were to be answered in the affirmative, in the sense that tracking could provide at least a partial solution to fighting the spread of the virus, a whole series of other considerations come into play, which also have to be very carefully analyzed. Data protection is a very obvious one, the right to privacy, but there's also the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of movement, the right to health, and of course, anti-discrimination. Initial examples have already pointed out that there may well be discriminatory or stigmatizing effects of tracking technology being used. As I said, I'll leave it to the experts, but I would like to finish with one observation. I had the occasion recently to, last weekend, share an article on Twitter written by an American colleague about the digital divide and tracking. And I think that is extremely important, because even if we manage to develop an app that does the job, that does respect fundamental rights, we must be very much aware that not everyone has a mobile phone, has a smartphone, and not everyone has access to the internet. So even if all the questions were to answered in the affirmative, let us make sure that what is a constitutional right in very few countries, and I think Finland is in Europe one of the very few countries that I think has the constitutional right of access to internet, that we provide that. And if the current crisis has shown anything, it has certainly shown how important it is that people can be online for their work, to stay in touch with loved ones, and possibly also to be safe when this app, where this app ever to be rolled out. Thank you very much. I look very much forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan Kleijsen, for this very substantial introduction. I think the direction has been set up, and now we can turn to our experts. So I will first give the floor to Michael Veale. We are very happy to hear you, Michael. You have the floor.
Great. Super. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a really fantastic opportunity to discuss, and of course it can't come too soon. I'm a researcher from University College London, and at University College London we're part of a group of 8 universities across Europe who think there is a privacy and data protection way, a much more proportionate way, to allow contact tracing that epidemiologists say they need and say they want to try in this particular crisis, without risking really what some of the fundamental rights we're trying to protect around data centralization, misuse of technology, and a potential function creep into other areas of our liberties. So the technology we have proposed is called DP3T. It's a protocol which is decentralized in nature. And what this means is that personal data, identifiable personal data in the sense of data protection law, does not actually leave an individual's device. We avoid creating a centralized database that can be misused or reused in ways that are not good for fundamental rights. But we also create the insights and the functions that epidemiologists have told us that they need. Effectively, the digital tracking apps that we are proposing don't use location data. This uses a huge amount of battery, is very coarse in nature. Epidemiologists have been saying we're not really sure location is a useful vector for, or proportionate vector for exploring this disease. You can't work out if 2 people passed. People might be on different floors of the same building, very far away. And people just won't use it because their battery will run out on their phone. Not only that, this data is very hard to effectively anonymize in any way. So instead, we focus on a technology that a lot of smartphones have since the early 2010s, since really 2012 or so, and that's called Bluetooth Low Energy. It's a technology that allows the listening and pinging out of small pieces of data on a regular interval. And we can also estimate the distance away that those data come from. So Bluetooth Low Energy is a system which, in theory, everyone can have enabled on their phones and can start to interact with other people to understand contact links. The functionality of the system, of all these contact tracing systems, is effectively such that when an individual goes and gets tested, they receive a test, and again, this relies on tests existing, so technology can only work with an enabling policy environment. These tests exist, and an individual can then say, oh, I have now tested positive, and then a computational process happens by which people who have come in close contact, we're talking 10 or 15 minutes, or maybe 2-3 meters away, that's the estimates we have right now, with that individual will just get an anonymous pop-up created locally on their phone to say, you are at risk. It won't say who or where or how. It will just say, please take this action. So that's the functionality we try to put in place. There are 2 main ways that you can make this kind of system. One is that effectively the data that you are sending out, these are random numbers generated all the time that are not recognizable to people, and they can't be used to track you across time. These random numbers and the random numbers that everyone else is listening to end up in the same central server. And this central server can create a detailed social network of these individuals. And this is very rich and sensitive data, of course. This is the kind of data that companies like Cambridge Analytica were seeking to access because it was so rich in nature. This is not the same data, but it is the same structure of data. The problem with this system is you can reuse and misuse this in quite a lot of ways, also to stratify society, also to potentially stigmatize individuals and apply coercive interventions against them. And in a world where this is a really, truly global pandemic, we have to be careful that the protocols that we make also work in countries that do not have the very strong legal protection for human rights, such as that the ECHR can provide, and such as that the rule of law provides inside member states that have strong respect for it. So we think we need to build an alternative system, and that was our mission. And our alternative system is designed such that this central database is never created because it is not technically necessary. So with this database, with this system, your phone only it listens to what it hears, and it sends out its random numbers. And when you are tagged as infected, you go and have a test, you are allowed to upload these random numbers anonymously that you have sent out, constantly changing random numbers. The server just has a large bucket of these random numbers. It can't use them to profile people. It can't re-identify people from them. These don't connect to each other, let alone to individual devices. But what they can do is every day, everybody in that entire country downloads the list of these randomly generated numbers and can check in the privacy of their own device whether any of these random numbers that they have downloaded match the ones they have privately seen. So nobody sees what you have seen. Nobody can create that social network. It is like everybody has a piece of the jigsaw, but nobody has the full puzzle, but the jigsaw still actually is functional. So this is the essence of what we've seen. So we published this openly. We're working very openly for criticism and for debate a couple of weeks back now. And we've had lots of revisions since, with lots of feedback from cryptographers, people from all disciplines feeding into this protocol, which is just a building block for an app. It's not the whole app. It's a building block for the app, but it's an important technical one. Now, last Friday, Google and Apple announced their partnership. Their partnership is very... there's two parts of this partnership which are very interesting. I'll start with the second part. The second part is that they announced that they will choose to roll out a similar app, a similar protocol to the one we developed, which is very technically similar. It similarly does not create a central database. We have some improvements we're suggesting to them to make it even more secure, but it is not it doesn't give them control of a central database, and they're just providing building blocks to help member states create their apps. Now, we can argue that it is a big power move for them to say, we're going to provide only one set of building blocks and maybe you should use it. But member states of all nation states are actually free to use their own code instead. There is no reason why they have to use Google and Apple's code. The second part, which is important, is that to save people's privacy on iPhones are very protective of Bluetooth. They do not let the Bluetooth that contact tracing apps currently need to be used without your phone screen being on at the time. So at the moment in Singapore, where an app has been deployed, people with iPhones have to leave their phones unlocked in their pockets. And if this means that their phone is stolen, it will not have a password on, all of their emails can be taken. And if a state mandates people to leave their iPhones unlocked, it is arguably a severe breach of Article 8, I would say, because it creates a lot of insecurity for the most vulnerable citizens. So Apple have said that they will change this protocol, but only for privacy-preserving apps like DP3T, which only do the matching on the device. There is a specific technical choice they have made to say, we will let people use the Bluetooth, but we do not think that the centralized database is required for contact tracing. Therefore, we will not let those apps use Bluetooth that way. So that's the long and short of this. But I want to also end on this quick tour with a discussion of what protocols cannot do. So protocols cannot ensure that member states do not effectively require you not to show a risk score when you go into a cinema or a place of work or a place of leisure or recreation. And this is a big problem because that is a coercive use of this technology. And this is something that we cannot solve with code. We need law, we need respect for human rights to ensure that the way citizens are asked to interact with the risk scoring system is not in breach of their fundamental rights. And that is one key part that is important. But what the protocol can do is effectively protect against this being used as an interlinked identity card that will follow you around anywhere. We can't protect about people We can't protect a law that says, show us your device, but we can protect against interventions that require coercive use of central databases. And as I say, we're working closely with epidemiologists, and they say, this is the data we need for contact tracing. We do not need lots of other forms of miscellaneous data that people are suggesting. And one of the most things they need is they need adoption. So they need people to trust the technology. A minimal technology that can be rolled out among a huge proportion of the population is much more useful to them than people who, a small proportion of the population, giving a lot of their data and freedoms away. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to this webinar today, and I'm happy to take questions later on as they arise.
Thanks a lot, Michael, for this very precise insight about your proposal. And I think that you mentioned one important word, trust. I know that Dino Pedreschi also work on that topic in Italia. He's an expert for the task force, and I'm sure that he could give us also very interesting insight on concrete use of this technology with our pros and cons. Dino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yannick and colleagues. Thank you for having me here today. Very happy to participate in this conversation, which is very timely and important. And yes, I would like to start from my very recent experience in this task force of the Italian government for somehow how data and models can help in facing the epidemics, especially towards the next phase. And actually, we are also working very much side to side with the epidemiologists and with people from the health system that it needs to take decision on how to exit the lockdown now, and to somehow go towards a very distributed and efficient epidemic surveillance that is very much focusing on two main things. The first one, as soon as we go into a situation where the big spikes are gone, there is the need of somehow controlling that new, let's say, resurgence of the epidemics at a large scale are contained. This means essentially two things. One is being able to test many people effectively, find as early as possible the positive to the virus, because we need to live for a phase where we will not be having vaccines, we will not be having effective drugs, and therefore the only weapon that we really have is in spotting the positive people as soon as possible, to contain, isolate them according to the epidemic surveillance processes, and ask them what are their contacts, recent contacts, to follow the transmission chains, follow new people that could have been infected, and do the same with them. So this is the first activity. This is what contact tracing is in practice. It's first of all a very hard work of an army of firemen, I would say, of people that is trying to spot the new little fires and contain them immediately. And the second part is to do the same thing at the level of communities. Because if many new cases somehow are clustered geographically in a neighborhood, in a hospital, in a shopping mall, it is necessary to do some other community level kind of interventions that somehow avoid that the fire begin again to be a big fire. And so the question is actually, before somehow talking about apps and digital technologies, the real basic question is, how can citizens help the firemen do their job, and preserve a common good, which is public health? How can we participate in this game actively rather than simply being tested, and if found positive, somehow follow the procedures? I mean, the lockdown has been already an example of this, right? We have somehow actively participated under a compression that has been first kind of voluntary, and then second is actually been compelled by laws and decrees. But essentially we have, compressed some of our liberty of movement, liberty of, whatever to help for this. Now we're talking about whether it's possible to find collective participation for solving the issue. And of course, I mean, when liberties are compressed, you need also somehow a rationale for that, and also deadlines, you know, to be clear that it's somehow only a temporary compression of some trade-offs between goals that are all legitimate in a constitutional democratic society. Now, of course, there are two approaches, right, that you can follow for somehow it's somehow enforcing people participation by digital surveillance, which I believe is not somehow compatible with democracy. Democracy means to foster the citizen active participation, and this is what we're discussing really about. Then we can start about what technology can help in doing. You know? The protocol that Michael Veale was discussing before me, it's one possible tool to help somehow improve the work of the fireman, to do a little bit more in tracing more contacts, maybe it's a way of expanding the memory of a person that is being tested positive. Ask for what were your contacts in the last few days. I mean, you also have another mean for not forgetting some that you didn't really somehow care about, or somebody you didn't know, but you don't remember, but you actually could be at danger now. So essentially, the point is what was discussed in the previous idea. For contact tracing, you can essentially put in place a very privacy-preserving way of storing at the personal device level your proximity contacts, your strong collocation using Bluetooth sensing technology in a way that is totally anonymous and can be arranged without any central repository, totally decentralized, and can be effective, although different from what happens in the real epidemic process. The epidemiologist, let's say, containment process, because in reality, a positive person would have been asked about who are the people you contacted, right? And name and surname, and somehow identified and contacted. In this game, instead, the people participating in the game would receive automatically from the system a warning that they could then use for instance, disclosing the fact that they were close to a positive person, and therefore they might voluntarily contact the health authorities for being tested and enter the procedure. So in a sense, what we are talking about is that a totally decentralized approach where personal information is stored on a personal data store, not shared with anybody, exclusive usage of, let's say, of the individual person, and it's only voluntarily disclosed when one becomes positive, which means also a possible threat to common health, to public health. Okay, and I would also mention that dealing with epidemiologists is not really true that they don't care about location. They do, because also being able to geolocalize appropriately the new positive, it's a very important science to spot spatial clustering that might somehow suggest there's a new outbreak coming out, which requires a different kind of treatment, different from contact tracing. And again, this is not something that it's by itself so problematic, in a sense that, first of all, this needs to be totally maintained decentralized and decoupled from contact tracing. You don't need to be constantly checked for your trajectory. What is actually interesting is that when you're tested positive, you are able to tell the people where was the places where you spent most of your time in the last few days. This is what is really important, with a very somehow loose spatial resolution that can again be totally. I mean, there are more than 10 years of work on how to disclose location information in a privacy-preserving way. And of course, I totally agree with Michael Veale before. Everything, of course, depends now on what kind of usage we want to do of this information at national level or with the specific apps. But the point here is that we are totally somehow capable of registering salient data at personal devices in personal data stores that are of exclusive control by the citizen, and only being disclosed on a voluntary basis and in a totally privacy-preserving way, both for contact tracing and separately for location, only when and if the person is tested positive and want to somehow participate actively in the game. I think this is very much important to do. There are, of course, different models. I totally agree with the DP3 model that has been presented by Michael Veale before for the contact tracing part. But we really need to focus on an important message. We are not trying to solve a problem with digital technologies. We are trying to solve the problem with a huge investment in people and people participation and expert work of the epidemiologists and the firemen on the place that can be helped to be even more effective with some digital tool. But we are not going to win this battle only thanks to an app. This must absolutely be somehow very well focused. I'm a computer scientist and I can testify for that. There's no magic in there. Certainly there are important aspects. One important aspect is that, like often happens in complex systems, and models explain that very much, it's not needed that everybody participate in this game. If there is a critical mass of citizens participating actively in this game, we can very effectively reduce help the epidemic forces to reduce the epidemics in a very effective way, and in a fashion that is very typical of many social complex systems. Like in traffic, we don't need all to be somehow respectful in traffic, but when you reach a critical threshold, things can immediately begin to get better very, very quickly. And this is also for epidemics. If we can somehow propose trustful, not only technology, but trustful games where people can play for being helpful to the common good, I think we can engage not everybody, but let's say 30, 40, maybe 50% of people, and with that, because the game would only somehow, what we're talking about would only somehow affect the participating citizens, could become, together with the firemen, very effective in containing the epidemics in the next phase, and allow us a safe return to slow but effective return to most of our activities and our liberties, even in a situation where we need to wait for time until drugs and vaccines work for us. Very final few seconds to tell that we have been also publishing a manifesto for this approach of personal data store, which I think it's very important to stress. I would like to somehow you to consider and help spreading this fact. It's already some time, at least 7-8 years, that people around the world, like me and also Michael Veale, I think many people around is pushing for this idea of empowering people with self-management of data in personal data stores that are under exclusive control of people. It cannot be somehow opened by anybody, even by police or whoever. These are very much under the exclusive control of people that can somehow ingest the data concerning basically all activities that a person want to record about himself or herself. And this is a very basic tool for personal awareness that could be very effectively put in place on a voluntary basis and with very strong privacy guarantees could be put in place for, let's say, objectives that are related to the common good. For instance, for better managing traffic and mobility. But in this case, If we would have this kind of tool in place already, and this could have been done securely and privately and in a effective way already, independently of the crisis, it would have been an extremely valuable tool now for facing a crisis, for facing, in this case, a very big epidemic. Because what we really need, we really favor a bit longer term pursuit of realizing this idea, where somehow giving the user an easy and trustful way to contribute to collective good in the measure everyone wants, enhancing self-awareness and also somehow cultivating the collective efforts for rebuilding society. It's a real challenge we are facing now. So thank you very much. This is the basic message.
Thank you very much, Dino. That was a very clear explanation. So, as I understand, those tracking systems could be trusted by the population if they have a decentralized structure and if they work on a voluntary basis. And now I'll turn to a lawyer, Adrien Basdevant. It will be for a lawyer to tell us if that's enough, if the population can feel protected enough in their liberties in order to voluntarily join the system. Adrien, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juliette. My connection is lagging, actually. I'm seeing Dino's face talking on mute while Juliette's voice is out loud. So if that's okay with you, I'd like just politely to turn off my video and so that I can talk to you as clearly as possible. Of course. One question I had is, does the state of health emergency have any precedence in our history? And it gets back to French philosopher Michel Foucault that explained that in the West, we traditionally had two ways of dealing with pandemic, and as a consequence of controlling individuals. The first one was the model of exclusion of the leper, and the second one was the model of inclusion of the plague. And according to Foucault, the substitution of these two models of control is one of the great phenomena that took place in the 18th century. So why am I telling you that? It's because the 18th century is when statistics appeared. And now that we have big data, aka advanced statistics and advanced data analytics, we could ask ourselves if we're witnessing or not the popularization of a third model of individual control. So first, let me get back really quickly to leprosy and plague, interesting subjects, to understand how we went from exclusion to inclusion. In the case of leprosy, it was a model of exclusion which we can call a model of marginalization. That is, there's a social practice based on the rejection of leprosy patients beyond the city walls. And in this model, we were letting those who were infected to die outside the city, basically, in order to be sure not to contaminate the others, which can appear to be terrible and really discriminatory practice. And on the other hand, you have the case of plague, where the population is no longer rejected but confined within the walls of the city. That is what we basically call quarantine. So every day you had inspectors that pass in front of every house. They had to stop and call out. Each individual was assigned to a window, and he or she has to appear, and her or his name was called out. And if she or he was to report to the window, being understood that if he did not report, he was in bed, and if he was in bed, he was sick, and if he was sick, he was dangerous, and therefore something had to be done. And this is how the individuals were sorted out between those who were sick and those who were not. And this model of inclusion makes it possible to scientifically investigate the population in order to try to cure them. So basically, this is how we got from punishment to discipline. And Foucault described how the use of statistical tools have revolutionized the control of pandemics and individuals. And I believe this is really important in the light of government issues arising today. Because if you have to sum it up, the exclusion of the leper was brutal. It was a rough way to deal with the situation. There were no measures. Whereas in the 18th century, statistics made it possible to apprehend mass phenomena. Hence, the government used what we called back then political arithmetic to manage an epidemic. And statistics were understood as some kind of objective instruments of state control, making it possible to distinguish between normal and abnormal behaviors. So this is how Foucault describes how individuals' bodies became object of disciplines on which continuous corrective mechanisms are being applied. And this emergence calls it, as you know, biopower, which literally is exercising powers over bodies, a power of normalization. So this introduction, just to tell you that, of course, I'm not Foucault. He's way more quick-witted than I am, but I'm trying to think, what would Foucault say today? And now that we have gone from statistics to big data, and extending his reasoning, I'm asking the question: is the 21st century is the century of the third age of individual control? Not that of exclusion, nor that of inclusion by confinement or quarantine, but that of inclusion by tracking. That is, of a certain freedom to come and go in return for real-time tracking and surveillance. Because basically, when we come to think about it, when you're confined, like for plague, you are in an inclusion model only limiting your physical freedom of movement. But when you are not confined anymore, and when you use an app, you become in an inclusion model which do not limit your physical freedom of movement, but can potentially limit your digital freedom. So the model of inclusion by tracking raises new challenges and issues. In appearance, it seems harmless because it is on a voluntary basis, but that might become binding and compulsory like it is in, I don't know, South Korea, China, or Israel, either by integrating it into common law or when an even bigger crisis, let's say randomly, an environmental one will occur, okay? So secondly, this shift would mean a transfer also, I believe, maybe a delegation of monitoring capabilities from states to individuals. We would have some kind of social peer monitoring. And more importantly, it could create new cases of discrimination. So every model, of course, leper, plague, COVID-19 actually showed new kind of discrimination. But as like you can think they disappear, they're just less visible, less tangible. So let me give you a concrete illustration of social stigma. The inherent philosophical problem of contact tracing or proximity tracing might be that it transforms a simple measure into a diagnostic. But the question we must ask ourselves, and I think Michael and Dino did, is how accurate would this measure be? So how can we avoid, for instance, false positive? Imagine a cashier that works behind a plexiglass window. She or he has mask on, gloves on, and that person will meet, I mean, like lots and lots of clients during a work day. So some of those clients will, be infected, of course, but it does not mean that this cashier will be contaminated as well. And the whole problem of this proximity tracing or contact tracing can be that the definition and the qualification of proximity might not be accurate enough or like precise enough. Few questions maybe like how is proximity defined? Like how long would it last? What is the distance that should be taken into account? So we were discussing about is it 2 meters, 3 meters? Is the context of the measure be taken into account? And for each of these criteria, what is the precision and the reliability? Because at the bottom, by way of conclusion, everything it's going to be about the reliability and effectiveness of the measure, right? So in other words, if we do not define precisely the conditions under which the system can trigger a decision, there will be people forced to be put in quarantine, whereas they should not, and also this could amplify existing inequalities. And my I mean, like, my personal belief is that the trivialization of the use of such technologies could result in accepting, in short or midterm, a possible application in different contexts, such as law enforcement or employee control. And I believe those apps should not become some kind of there's a lot of discussion around the immunity passport, but I would say, in short, like, we should not make it compulsory for any citizens, any user, or any client. We should not make it compulsory to show some kind of green light before entering a shop, before benefiting from a service or going to work. And as a consequence, I would have just quickly two sets of recommendation, or like not recommendation, but food for thought. First, I think we should create dedicated multi-factors risk impact assessment. To implement responsible data sharing in time of crisis, we must create technological framework assessment that are adapted and tailor-made for COVID-19. I believe the two main and comprehensive framework that already exists are Convention 108 of the Council of Europe and maybe the GDPR. So let's assume, like, if we take as a basis a data protection impact assessment, we should upgrade it. We should upgrade it so that it deals perfectly with the legal and the ethical issues. As such, a new right could be like not the right to access or the right to erase, but the right to turn off. In other words, to enable tracing only when wanted or when needed. That could be really helpful. Imagine, for instance, a situation in 2 months. So the confinement period is progressively resorbing or ending, where you could go to meet, I don't know, like for political, for religious or medical reason, anyone. You might want your app to be turned off at that particular moment. So I believe we should take this opportunity to create dedicated PIA and to strengthen them. A few comments and ideas on this. Firstly, I noticed that lots of people talk about PIA instead of DPIA. And this is surely because we often confuse privacy and data protection, which are actually two distinctive values. And also the fact that we always refer to privacy tend to make us forget about the other social values at stake that Michael and Dino talked about, such as due process, fairness, non-discrimination. So I'd like to suggest that if we upgrade those DPA, we actually need to integrate some kind of multi-factor impact assessment encompassing discrimination and other challenges such as digital divide, so to ensure that already marginalized populations are not put aside. And my last and final point would be, we lack legal standards around data anonymization. I believe this is really important. You all know that personal data is currently defined as any information that relates to identified or identifiable natural person, as opposed to anonymization, which constitutes an irreversible way to prevent identification. And as you know, case studies and research publications have shown for a long time how difficult it is to create a truly anonymous data set. And the problem we have here is that there is no international, no regional standard or referential around anonymization. One of the rare literature on the subject remains Working Party 29 Opinion 5 that dates from 2014, which let's say it's not really up to date to the current state of the art. And especially considering the progress made in fields such as differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, or other combination of cutting-edge techniques. So to finish on this note, I believe that, like, the Working Party opinion elaborates on the robustness of each techniques based on 3 criteria. Is it still possible to single out an individual? Is it still possible to link records relating to one individual to some of the data set, and can information be inferred concerning this individual. So the priority, I believe, should be defining what is the acceptable technological threshold from which data could be deemed anonymized or not. And we should have a debate and upgrade that kind of 2014 framework on whether we believe re-identification of a person using such COVID-19 technologies that everybody's discussing today and more generally in the public debate. Do we believe that the re-identification of a person using such technologies is or not possible, taking into account all of the means reasonably likely to be used? And this maybe would be the way to promote innovation while protecting civil liberties.
Thanks a lot, Adrien, for this all this food for thought. A lot of things. You mentioned a lot of things. I think one important thing is, of course, this kind of new era of individual control. But I will let the floor now to some questions. Just to organize that round of questions, I will let the floor first to our three colleagues on board, Sophie, Livia and Clementina, and then a final round of question and conclusion by Patrick and our two directors, Claudia and Jan. I will just let the floor first to Sophie Kwasny. She's head of data protection unit. I'm sure that the last word of Adrien, of course, raised a lot of questions. And just for the answer to our expert, I propose to use exactly the same order than your intervention. Michael could answer first, then Dino, and finally Adrien. Sophie, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Yannick. Good morning to all. Buongiorno, bonjour. Fascinating points have been made by each of you. So for the sake of time, because I saw some of you reacted to the other messages, I will just highlight very briefly the relevance of the work that the Council of Europe is doing in that field, in the field of privacy, in the field of data protection. Adrien, you did mention Convention 108. Dino, this analogy with the fireman is really touching and true. And it's also true that if it's unprecedented times and the fact that the firemen now can use the data, and we've seen highlights about the fact that personal data helped save life this time. This is new. How do we achieve this without damaging what we have been building for decades? For decades, the Council of Europe has been trying to find the right balance, precisely respecting the right to data protection and the right to privacy, and preserving other fundamental interests. Lately, in the modernization of our convention, we've pushed for new principles. Adrien also mentioned the DPIA, data protection impact assessments, but also privacy by design. And everything that Michael has been presenting, and Dino too, is a perfect illustration of privacy by design, privacy by default. So it's really marvelous to see this illustration. What I also want to highlight about the relevance of the work of the Council of Europe and the convention is just like the virus, the coronavirus, it knows no frontiers. And so the work that we are doing on data protection, which is a work of global relevance, is used in all regions of the world, and this is fundamental. It's fundamental technically in terms of the interoperability, like the one that Michael mentioned, but also legally speaking. And so the chair of the Committee of Convention 108 and our Data Protection Commissioner adopted jointly a declaration on the 30th of March, which you can find online, but recalling the key principles. And what was great was to see that we had African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries fighting the coronavirus, saying how those principles were important for them. So my question, a lot has been said, but just to come back to the privacy by design and privacy by default, which is the core of the applications tracking apps that are now being developed, I would like to know what you consider as experts, but also as a lawyer, as really the key privacy enhancing capacities and features of this system. What is really crucially needed? for the population and each of us to really adopt those apps. And another question, which is more a legal question, but which comes back to Michel Foucault and the surveillance state. For some cases, it's based on the consent. And I think Adrien mentioned the fact that they should definitely not be compulsory systems. But so based on the consent, can we actually consider that my consent is a free consent when either there is such a social pressure around the fact that this needs to be adopted really widely for the system to function, or even worse, and it's been seen, the fact of not adopting and having the app would actually restrict my freedom of movement. Can in that case my consent be considered free? So I give the floor back to you, and thank you again.
Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to say a couple of quick words on that. Thank you very much, Sophie. Obviously, a challenge with the high international conventions and this particular issue is just how fast things are moving on the ground. And I think regulators in practice are unwilling to place themselves in the way of issues or even enforce data protection by design. I was heartened to see this morning the European Data Protection Board come out and say that a decentralized version of this approach is more in line with that principle. However, your consent point is really important here, and we have to consider the political economy of these things. One reason why I do have concerns about what Dino was presenting is because in an ideal world, I think it sounds great. But in the world we live in, if you ask people to self-monitor on their devices, this becomes an extremely valuable thing for governments to access and to put legal requirements on you to provide. Whether you're an immigrant worker and you're then told it's normalized that you track yourself and that you produce this data, or that you provide this data in times of emergency. We see this in the UK with mobile phone booths that police operate to extract data locally from mobile phones. So I think these things do need to be considered, because the privacy by design also has to be resistant against the political economy side of it. So that's why in the approach we designed, it was resistant to that, and even if somebody accesses your phone, that does not mean that they can learn a huge amount about you. But I am very aware, and I think I agree with Dino. It does help to use technology as an aid to help contact tracers in all these situations. One last thing to say, which is interesting about anonymization, to the other point that was raised about anonymization standards. In our system, I work as a data protection law academic, so I do understand the case law around this, and I think this is really key. We're not promoting false anonymization in the cloud. This is serious privacy engineering. This is not cookies pretending they're not personal data from cookie identifiers. So this is all comes together. But I agree strongly with Dino that we have to bear in mind what is useful to people on the ground. But equally, have to bear in mind that we don't just create new vectors that can be misused with law, because realistically, data protection does not stop the kind of powers that governments are seeking to use now in a way that we might like it to.
Thanks. Dino, maybe do you have something to add?
Absolutely. First of all, because I believe that the privacy by design approach is the core of what we're talking about. We're precisely talking about how to develop a privacy preserving approach that can be useful to the purpose of contrasting the epidemics, and that's precisely the kind of approach that I advocate very much. One line of little disagreement with Michael, but I think it's more in the, let's say, in the narrative rather than in the essence, is that I believe that we should begin to think about our digital society and the rights we do have in a world that is not only analog but also digital should not be somehow compressed by the current state of technology. Technology is not the end. It's a mean. Even if it seems so pervasive today, we should not devise our institution on the basis of what technology can deliver to us today, right? Because what technology delivers to us today is simply the end and the consequence of a lot of economic pressure, of powers that are fighting to each other. So it's not, let's say, the normal outcome of what the digital should be, but it's simply a very imperfect and primitive situation brought from the battle of powers up to now. I think we have in our generation, as somehow the task of defining what are the democratic principles of a digital society, which is inherently different from what we were inhabiting before, exactly for the data, exactly for the fact that a digital society is like an analogic society, plus the fact that everything can be possibly recorded. And the key question, from my point of view, is who records this? And the answer to this question is not the governments, the companies, the corporation, but it's the people. It's the individual people recording the data concerning herself or himself in a safe way, in a way that cannot be stolen, cannot be somehow by anybody, by corporations or by governments. And this is the basic of a democratic interaction between citizens and the collective institutions and the markets and the companies. Okay, and I mean, this is I believe is our aim. Whether technology does not allow us to have this dream already in place, I mean, it's just a requirement that the democratic society should push towards technology because it is devised in a human way and not in a let's say a corporate dependent or government dependent way. And that's why I really believe that we need to strive for a solution that is not hacking a solution for every specific problem. No, I like very much the DP3T solution for contact tracing. It's a very interesting, let's say, privacy-preserving solution, but it's a hack. It's not. It's a hack for a problem, right? And instead, we need something different from a hack for a problem. We need a way to deal with the issues of a democratic society in the digital age under emergencies like the one we are discussing now. And so we really need to discuss about principles. One final observation I wanted to stress about an interesting point of the conversation. One thing that it's important of the solution that we are discussing, including the DP3 solution for contact tracing, is that they are absolutely opt-in solution, right? In the sense that when you you are participating in the game, first of all, and you know that participating in the game may mean that you sometimes we receive a message, a private message from you, from the system, not from an authority, telling you were close enough to a person that was tested positive. It's up to you to decide what to do next, whether you show up at the authority and get tested and enter or not. Okay, so it's truly a participatory game, and I think this is an important part of the solution that we're discussing about.
Thanks a lot, Dino. And to conclude, Adrien, maybe you have some also maybe thought about that. Adrien, the floor is yours.
Sure. I'm really fascinated by DP3T. Actually, I believe decentralization and privacy by design are keys. And it's great that such initiative exists. Thank you, Michael, and your colleagues to work on this project. Some countries, unfortunately, will sadly not implement such standards. Putting this aside, I'm less concerned about the app in itself, that the context in which the app will be deployed. Let me give you examples. When I hear a famous French journalist say this week that it will be a consent basis, it will be on a consent basis, and people that will use the app will be the first to benefit from some serology testing, I don't hear the real voluntary basis. I hear social pressure. When I hear a leading voice in the startup ecosystem explaining that the main goal of even an open source and decentralized app is to send names of people to governments so that they can be put into quarantine, I believe also there should be some kind of clarification on the context. So to answer your question, Sophie, I think it should not be mandatory, and I agree with Dino on that point. As far as discrimination, for instance, is concerned, I believe the use of such app will never be mandatory, neither by government nor by private parties. Otherwise, you have new forms of discrimination that will emerge. for instance, when accessing physical spaces like a grocery store, when going to work, or if someone is being refused government benefits because she or he hasn't installed the app. So it should be based on another, it should be based on legal basis, like the GDPR approach. But the huge risk is that, and actually like in other sectors, consent will not be free because of the social pressure you talked about.
Thank you very much to our three experts for their answers. We'll now start a second round of questions, and for this purpose, I'll give the floor to Clementina Barbaro, who's from the Secretariat of the Council of Europe. So, Clementina, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Juliette. I would like to thank warmly the experts for their very enlightening presentation. You just mentioned that I am responsible for the Secretariat support to the CAHI, the Ad hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence of the Council of Europe, which is currently working on the development of a legal framework on artificial intelligence. And we all think that the current circumstances certainly confirm the importance of the elaboration of a comprehensive and also, I would say, an effectively implementable legal framework on AI, including in times of emergency. We can see that it is very likely that AI and digital technologies will be certainly more used in the future. We hope that they will be not misused, but of course this is what a legal framework in principle should prevent. So I would like to go back to an issue which was already raised in the debate, and which is the technology on which contact tracing applications are based. So in most cases, this is not AI. We know that there is resort to GPS technology or even Bluetooth, for instance, like in the DP3T contact tracing application to which reference was made earlier. And so my question to the experts concerns the limits of this technology, and in particular, to which extent can we trust it? Bearing in mind that there are growing concerns on the large number of false positives that this technology can create. So I can give you an example which was broadly referred to by media, by public sources, which in fact, for instance, the fact that I could ping the Bluetooth of my neighbor, my home neighbor, who is just a few steps away from me. So the Bluetooth would detect him, but in fact there would be a wall separating us, and we would not be really in contact, even though certainly proximity event would be recorded by the Bluetooth application. So this could be in reality even counterproductive in a perspective of prevention of COVID-19. It could give a false indication, and then perhaps my neighbor would get concerned and worried, and would, I don't know, call the hospitals or the emergency services to ask, to ask for help. So my question to the experts is really, how can we address this? How we could prevent the rise of the number of false positives which is generated by this technology? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Clementina. So technology question, I think we'll turn first to Michael Veale and then to the other experts.
Oh yeah, I'll answer quickly so we've got enough time. Like with any technology, this is going to be a difficult thing to manage. We in our team have built in lots of mitigations for these kind of attacks. So some people worried about drive-by attacks where you affect a lot of people. These are now no longer possible in our system. Our system has to hear a very long set of keys before it can figure out the real key. When we're talking about through a wall, I agree there are times where that can be a problem. We're still working on if we can fully mitigate this. But these walls, we understand, also have to be quite thin plasterboard. You have to be quite close between them for about 15 minutes of the phones being close. So it's not as terrible as people are making out. But that does not mean these are not problems. So the point is that these will always be first versions, and there will always be challenges. People can also turn off these Bluetooth pings or choose times that they're not going to release when they were infected. Those are also possible in our system. So there are lots of mitigations, but we also don't want to take an engineering mindset and over-engineer before we've seen it iteratively with society. So we can try and preempt some of these problems, but there's no way that we can preempt them all. So these have to be. This is an experiment. There's huge political demand for this. This is going to happen, regardless of whether people choose our protocol or not. And all we can do is steer it to a view where it is more privacy friendly, but also hopefully people are aware that this is a first trial. There will be rockiness at the beginning because we can't promise that there won't be. But hopefully we can mitigate these and find even more ways to mitigate more as we continue.
Thank you, Michael. Dino, would you like to add something to this answer? Yes, please.
Yeah, very quickly, another observation. I do agree with Michael. I would also add that consider that what we are trying to do with this content tracing is, again, expanding the ability of focusing tests on a population that is more likely to be positive rather than others. If you remember that the key objective is that we cannot test for the entire population. That would be the best, right? Make a test to everybody, but it's not doable. The point is that how to focus the testing capacity in a way that it's as able as possible to somehow spot the real positives, right? And actually, even the test has some issues with the specificity and accuracy. I mean, by itself. But the point is that this is the game we are trying to do. So, I mean, alert a person that it was under a wall, that it will probably be tested for nothing. It's still doable, and it's not a social stigma because the person is being contacted anonymously. So I don't see this as really a major point. The major point is to be as effective as possible to test effectively the population to stop the positive circulation as early as possible. And also remember that this is actually, as a way of pursuing this goal, is less intrusive compared to what people do in real life. I mean, in real life, the epidemiologist would ask the surveillance person would ask the positive, who are your contacts, and by name and surname, and they will be contacted one after the other. So in a sense, this is a way to amplify this part with other possible people that might have been in contact unawarely. So I mean, it's acceptable kind of intrusion.
Thank you very much, Dino. I wonder if Adrien would like to add something.
Lots have been already said, actually, but of course there are risks, and of course the need to protect digital rights is not something new. But I'd like to add something. I think it's also a fantastic opportunity for citizens to fully grasp this societal issue. It is a really important moment because we have often lack narratives, and we have often lack story to tell around digital world, which remains for a lot of people some kind of intangible reality. Of course, we had Snowden with the NSA, Max Schrems with the Privacy Shield. We had Christopher Veale and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But those moments count among the rare stories that have been discussed by the general public. And it's a shame. And it's a shame that we always need disaster. We always need, like a crisis to happen to take into account such issues. So now is another moment. So let's make the best out of it. I think it's a really important moment for that public debate around core fundamental freedoms and digital right issues.
Thanks a lot, Adrien, and to the other experts also for this set of questions. I saw that Claudia wants to ask a question. We are just organizing the question with Livia. Claudia, if you allow me, I just give the floor first to Livia and then to you. Livia, Stoica is also the other co-secretary of the CAHI, and I would like to let her the floor.
Thank you, Yannick, and I'd like to join my thanks also with my colleagues for the excellent presentations of the experts, as they have been touching upon the key issues of concern for the work of the ad hoc committee on artificial intelligence. Now, I'd like perhaps to touch upon a specific issue, which is obviously the complex relationship between surveillance and democracy, and the concern that we all share that the management of the COVID-19 pandemic will actually shape the future of surveillance enabled by AI. Now, obviously, in our work of the CAHI for the development of legal framework and for the development of pan-European standards or even global standards for AI, we need to take into account and address a number of concerns upon which I think all three presentations have we equally touched upon. One of them is obviously the concerns that the tools that are being developed are having perhaps the authoritarian habit of surveillance quite baked into their design. We're also concerned about their use, their misuse, and especially about the potential long-term use and impact, and how this surveillance could actually damage democracy. So perhaps I'd like to have a question which touches both on the technological dimension, both in terms of design and use, but also on the legal framework implications for which we are actually conducting our work. How can we really ensure that these tools do not make individuals get used to massive surveillance methods and relinquish voluntarily their individual rights? And I know that Sophie's question has touched a bit on the notion of free consent, but if perhaps you could elaborate slightly more on that. And looking at the legal dimension and the pan-European standards that we are developing, how can we actually ensure that the gaps that are being identified at this moment in time should be actually properly identified and addressed? And if perhaps the last speaker could also build a little bit more on what standards have been identified as lacking. I mean, I understand from the presentation earlier on that although we've been talking about anonymity, nothing is really anonymous, and obviously there may be further work to be done in this area. But there are obviously other dimensions that we would like to look at in this context. Non-discrimination was early addressed. If we could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what should be the focus of our concern for pan-European standards for AI in this context. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Livia. And because we are running late, I'm just checking the time also. Claudia, maybe you can raise your point or question now also if you want, and we will give the floor to the expert just after.
Thank you, Patrick. My question is more about, somebody said about the sense, to make sure we have a real sense that we can tell citizens what they're engaging for. And from that perspective, I have a question about the use of this app. What happens to asymptomatic carriers that are, of course, responsible for much of the spreading? How can they be accounted for? And because they're so numerous, wouldn't a random type testing, tracing be much more effective than trying to catch every single citizens, because that would require, to be really effective, testing the entire population? We know that's very difficult. So I have a question about the essence and whether epidemiologists would be more content with something that gave them that kind of information rather than tracing the single individual, with also the problem that Clementina raised about the false, because we're relying very much on the solidity of testing. which we know is not 100% guaranteed. So how do you square all these difficulties? And this question brings me to the fact that this conversation needs to include epidemiologists, because we're doing this for a purpose. They are at the requesting side, and then there is a receiving end, which is public authorities, health institutions. So for me, this discussion, while extremely interesting, lacks other partners in order to provide what Dino says, the true sense and the trust. Because citizens are only going to be trusting this if they know that it's not some app that is being designed by whoever, however reliable and well done. They're going to trust it if they know that the information that they're voluntarily giving has a sense. Where is it going to? What purpose would it serve? Would it be for scientists? Would it be for public authorities to decide what restrictions, etc.? So I think there needs to be a full dimension of this conversation for me in order to understand the true implications and therefore the trade-offs that you have so well and clearly explained. Thank you.
Michael, please. The floor is yours.
For both those questions. So firstly, on what we've done to build in, to resist function creep and what could be done in the future. These are very important questions. So one of the things that we've done to build in particular in this instance, which as Dina says, is a hack at the moment. I think that's all we can respond to. I think a crisis is a very bad time to build institutions and to make a big, considered change. But we can, of course, learn from it. What we've done is a couple of things. Firstly, it may seem arcane, but a very important part is that the identifiers, the random identifiers, are decided randomly on your device. So this means that some systems give you what they say is a random identifier to send out to the world from a server. They say, send out this one, please. And they might say this is random, but one day it might not be random. One day it might be chosen. And so it can extend in that direction. The way our system is designed, it cannot extend in that direction. That is one of the ways we stop surveillance linking to persistent identifiers that can be creeping in that way. However, this is, of course, not enough because surveillance is also about how you can use power, not just how you can use data to understand people. And so what I would suggest for thinking about this in the future, and one thing Council of Europe might want to consider, are things like a right to repair or a right to refuse participation in a protocol. Privacy-enhancing technologies are very powerful, but as we've shown, you can make a system that can risk score people in a totally anonymous way. That is the point of it. Mathematically, it is not a fake anonymous way. It is something that can exercise something. It can apply a risk score that power can be exercised on the basis of in a wholly anonymous way. This means that data protection that bases itself on personal data is not enough. You need also the right to be able to refuse to participate in a computation. You need the right to be able to repair a device and not have a change to your operating system that you did not consent to. This is more like e-privacy in European law about any kind of interference with your terminal device. So that's very important to retain. Lastly, on asymptomatic people and epidemiologists. Asymptomatic people, I agree, there's not enough testing, but we can't test the entire population constantly. So you need a combination. That's what I'm just channeling the epidemiologists we work with here. I know they probably should be in the conversation, but that's all I can do. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I can say what they told me. Randomized testing, sampling is great to start to seed the trickle down. So you can say, oh, this person, now we know's got it, now we can trace where they are. And then something like an app might help to be able to basically amplify the power of those limited number of tests. And that's the point of contact tracing in general. So you can then target your tests in a way that's not random because you're targeting with a good chance of finding people who you can then trace further. With epidemiologists, I agree they should be in the room. I also know that they are under a huge amount of pressure and demand. And so we work closely with them in our project. I hope other people do too more broadly around the world. And that's key to have them. But not only them, as we develop these things, representatives from all parts of society. But it's very hard to do that in our current situation at the speed we're working at, having to deliver things and to try and make a difference.
Thanks, Michael. Dino?
Yes, only very quickly on this final part. Yes, by working side by side with the epidemiologists, you see very clearly that Of course, it's also important to conduct large-scale random testing to understand better, for instance, the incidence of. There are a number of parameters about this new disease that are not known yet. For instance, if you want to understand the incidence, the speed at which the disease spreads, you need to go for random tests repeated over time. But for what concern, when you actually want to do the fireman work I was talking about, you really need to go to individual, hopefully few positive tests, trace back the transmission chains, and simply stop the fire. No, that's what, and you need to do this in the most effective possible way. You can simply do it with asking people and with the work of the firemen on the ground. Or you can try to somehow empower more this activity, also using digital instruments. Of course, this must be done once again in a truly participatory way. And I come to the question by Livia. I think it's very important. I believe that also it was also said before by Adrien. So we have really a fantastic way of somehow showing for real people how participating in a game together can help reach a common good with an incredibly effective, let's say, result. And it's a shame that this is done only by an emergent, because this could work for ordinary life, for many other challenges we face. But so we should really stress the fact that it is a voluntary experiment, and if we are, a large enough number, we can be very helpful to somehow create a collective, important result for everybody. How not to get used to being overexposed to that? Because this is a very interesting question. And I think it's very much linked to aware participation. We are participating in a game with a purpose, with a minimal collection of information. Most of it actually is not even collected because it's totally, anonymous and left to the protocols. If any other information is collected, like it is by the epidemiologists on the ground, of course, the epidemiology on the ground register the cases, geolocate it, and use it for everything will be forgotten as soon as possible as the emergency is over. So we need somehow to be somehow very well informed about voluntary participation to a game with a purpose, with a beginning and an end, with completely clear engagement rules for what we are donating and what we are receiving in exchange, and both as individuals and as a collective. And this is the way, in my opinion, to tell the story, which is democratic engagement of people in a common goal.
Thanks, Dino. Thanks a lot. Adrien, a very short answer, because again, we are running late. Thanks, Adrien.
Okay, so the effectiveness of the technological tools we are discussing today has not been evaluated yet. And we have seen how the deployment of big data tracking, for instance, during the Ebola outbreak, could lead to the violation of people's rights while doing very little to combat the disease. So as a consequence, I agree with the question that has been raised. It is the responsibility of scientists, and in particular of epidemiologists, to beforehand, that is, before deploying any of these apps, guarantee that it would be useful in reducing the number of infections. The second point, and to end by this note, I think this crisis is qualified as a state of exception, and in a number of countries, emergency law have been or are going to be enacted. And of course, no one seriously questions the need to protect public health and safety, but which should respect human rights, because history tends to show that exception to civil liberties protection made in a time of crisis, and I agree with Michael, I think crisis is a bad timing to build institutions, often remain much longer after this crisis. And I agree also with Dino when he talks about the beginning and the end. This is the question, the crucial question of temporality. We must define, and I will conclude by that, and we must plan in advance that what are the criteria to determine the end of the health emergency. In other words, at what point should exceptional measures put in place during a crisis be lifted, and when to reactivate exceptional measures to prevent a new epidemic? And in the meantime, should the collected data be retained, and if so, by whom and under what conditions? So if we do not answer those questions, we could very well live in a permanent state of exception, and the 21st century could be a state of permanent crisis.
Thanks a lot, Adrien. It will be time to conclude. Just Michael, I receive from you just a little notice about a possible legislation. Just maybe in 1 minute, if you can say a last word about that.
Yeah, so we're very worried about the way these technologies, despite being private, can be misused. So in the UK, myself and some other academics have drafted a bill that actually says you cannot mandate these things. You cannot refuse people entry on the basis of risk score without due safeguards, and so on. And this is a constant work in progress, but I'm happy to send the link afterwards. This is all open, and we're all happy to take feedback. People are interested in other countries, and it would be good to think of what structure of provisions could limit the use of these, not just the use of the data. So thanks a lot for that.
Great, Michael. Thanks a lot. And of course, we will publish with this webinar some links on our internet website. You will have all the full information on social media, etc., how to find these links. So, Juliette, I think it's time to conclude now.
Yes, thank you, Yannick, for the floor. We are approaching the end. It's time to thank not only our experts for their fantastic contribution, but also you, Yannick, for having organized this conference in a very atypical way. But I think the virtual side of our work did not at all reduce the interest of this work. It was really very informative and very nice. So in order to conclude, we will now hear Patrick Penangs for a short conclusion. You have the floor, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What I feel is that we are working obviously in time constraints. There are quite a number of unknowns in the current equation. That is, how many people were infected, how many have become immune, how many have been in contact, etc., etc. And basically, we're still lacking quite a bit of the basic material to be able to develop any kind of a strategy. And in that context, even if we don't find the medical solutions, we're trying to find quick solutions magic solutions in a way, that are going to help us in trying to contain the spread of this virus. Within that context, we should really think about what are the kind of measures that we want to put in place and what do we want to achieve with those measures. As Dino said also, the battle will not just be won with a magical application. There's no magic in there. I think it is important that we know that we have all the parameters right. I think the measures that have to be put in place have to be adequate, obviously, and we need to define what this adequacy is going to be. They have to be proportionate, they have to be lawful, they have to be necessary in our democratic society. And from our discussion, I also gathered that a decentralized system on a voluntary basis is probably the way forward. We have to take into account due process, fairness, non-discrimination, and what Jan said at the beginning, the increasing digital divide. I think this application, even though it sounds so innocent in a way, it will in a way be a test to the robustness of our human rights protection and our human rights system. And that is, I think, we need to take that into account, and that's why we also see there is such an immense public debate on how these applications are going to be applied in the future. That would be my conclusions on that.
Thanks a lot, Patrick, for this last word. And I propose now for a conclusion to give the floor to Claudia and Jan if they wish to give us some insight to conclude. Claudia, please.
Thank you, merci, Yannick. It was a fascinating discussion. I think through the beginning of looking at an app, we found many more other important aspects that, of course, pertain to the use of technology. In this particular, we started with COVID. Of course, we only looked at one side, one face of the epidemics, which is the social control or the tracing or tracking system. I don't know whether we can use those words in the same way. But there are, of course, other fantastic uses that can be done for diagnostic purposes, for treatments that we're not aware of. So I think we have to keep that this is only one exploration of one particular phase of the epidemics, and there are many others. Having said that, I was quite taken by the proposal and provided the parameters that Patrick just mentioned that, of course, satisfy the Council of Europe's requirements. But what fascinated me was that, indeed, if we have a decentralized system that is using privacy by design, that allows the free, obviously, consent to play, which allows citizens to actually help cure, help in a sanitary crisis. I think this is what should be presented to the citizens. So the way you present the importance of such exercise is crucial. It must be very convincing from that point of view, because trust will be derived by the soundness and solidity of the arguments. So I think what needs to happen if this is successful, and I find it, as I said, fascinating way of democratic participation, because that's the area I come from, it must be told well. It must, I insist, enjoy the participation of different actors, because there is a very interesting phenomenon now. Citizens are trusting much more scientists, which is fantastic. Exit the anti-vaxxers, and people are listening to doctors, to people who are dealing with a crisis. So we must bring them in the conversation. They're crucial, and so are, of course, the public authorities, and of course the developers, the private companies that are starting this race to produce the ultimate app. So I think it has to have both participatory dimension when it comes to the citizens, but also to the other partners. I have one thing that we haven't discussed that leaves me not dubitative, but I think it needs to be checked, is whether the data collected can be shared across frontiers, and whether the nomenclatura states have to use it allows them to actually take care of this in a universal and a global way. Because whilst we can have a divide inside our countries, we may have even a bigger divide across countries, and we may in the end not be very effective, because the little we know about this COVID is that it will continue traveling, and maybe at different times of the year. So the only question I'm left with, one of the questions left is this going to be effective if only few states use it, or what is the critical number of countries that need to be sharing this with the same nomenclatura is needed for this to be very effective. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody very much. It's been a fascinating couple of hours this morning. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Claudia, for your presence. Jan, maybe a very last word, and we will conclude.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I have 4 points. The first, well, 5. The first is to thank everyone, especially our experts, for having joined us. Grazie mille. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. 4 points then on substance. First of all, if there is going to be an app, it has to be linked to a testing or treatment option. I think that is absolutely essential. Otherwise, it will not gain the trust and it will not do the job. Secondly, and that replies partly to Claudia's question, I think it's essential to whatever will be adopted, there'll be an international agreement on the protocol used. And I'm very reassured by what Michael told us about the DP3T the interest in this by the Apple-Google conglomerate. Because if these two giants will back this kind of thinking, I think that is hugely reassuring, also for an international agreement and acceptance of it. Second point. Third point, I come back to my introduction. Let us not forget that not everyone is online, that not everyone has a smartphone, and that especially the most vulnerable people, I'm thinking of the elderly here, may not have, at least at present, access to this. So it's extremely important to have that in mind. And fourth, and I fully agree with Michael and others who've said that, it will happen. There's going to be enormous pressure on governments to come up with something because of the anxieties. It's therefore essential there be a critical assessment, and I very much hope and I very much trust that the discussion today will have contributed, will have given arguments, food for thought to our decision makers, and we'll do our best to ensure that it is widely shared. Once more, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, everybody. We will conclude this very special IE breakfast quite late. It's not breakfast at all time, maybe for you now. We will see if we run the next IE breakfast in this virtual manner. The positive thing is that we could promote that quite widely outside of Strasbourg. And I want to warmly thank Michael Veale, Dino Pedreschi, and Adrien Basdevant to be with us today. And of course, thanks University of Strasbourg for the support, and thanks to Juliette for that. Goodbye, everyone, and have a nice day. Keep safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Thanks for everything.
Thanks.
Great.